Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. And this is part 2 of the J72 tanks, and we're going to be looking at this Bachmann model in this episode. This is a older one. This isn't the brand new DCC fitted equipped loco. This is the split chassis one from the 2000s era, which was the follow up to the 1980s version that we saw in the last episode. So I'm just going to put this steam pipe detail back on there that has become unclipped. It's a waste of time because I end up taking the cab roof off later on anyway. And I'm going to give this a battery test to see if it runs, and it's slightly sluggish. It's trying to run, but it's not running brilliantly. It's almost like it's gummed up. So we're going to strip this one down and have a look at the differences between this and the mainline one. DCC fit this, and like I said, do a bit of a comparison. Body removal is exactly the same, front screw and then rear clip. And you can see that the chassis has been redesigned. The mainline one is in the background there. This was obviously filmed simultaneously. And they've lost a lot of the big motor weight out of the cab. They've got this flat motor with a big worm gear on, although it is still the split chassis affair. Although obviously DCC fitting this is going to be different to the mainline one. So I'm going to strip it down like we did the other one, take the wheels out, and inside is loads of this horrible orange grease that is almost solidified. No wonder it wasn't running very well. So I'm going to strip this down completely to clean it all up, and then we'll have a look at fitting a digital decoder to this one. So you remove all the screws out of one side of the chassis half like we did before, and you'll notice there that this model is also fitted with a little driver figure, but I will remove him later to fit the chip. And there's the motor driving the worm gear, and yeah, there is a lot of old manky grease in there, and one of those dividers has also split. So I'm going to have to clean all this up. I'm not reassembling it with this old grease. I have to get the pliers to remove the worm gear because it was stuck in place. And then when I get a cotton bud and meths, you will see now this horrible, thick factory lubrication that has gone. I mean, that is almost like earwax. It is disgusting. So I'm going to clean everything up now with a cotton bud and meths. This removes 99% of the oil and grease. And working methodically and steadily, I managed to remove it all eventually. But just look at it; it's so thick. And for a motor with a worm gear that size, not to be able to turn it properly, you can just see how solidified it had actually got. So now I'm just cleaning all around the axles because obviously these are pivotal for these models. The current collection is through the axle holes in both sides of the chassis. I'm also going to remove the motor, and you can see there that the plastic cover has got a coating of yellow oil all over it. Remove these springs as they're not needed, and then with a cotton bud, a dry cotton bud, I'm removing all that excess oil from the inside of that plastic insulating sleeve on the motor. And it did take quite a while to clean all this up. I was working on this for about 30 minutes to remove all the grease and grime to get it back. And then what I've done, I've jumped forward a little bit now, and I'm actually reassembling the chassis. Now you'll see on the motor that I've actually soldered the harness for the decoder onto the motor and insulated the terminals. So that is the orange and grey wires are on the motor terminals. I lost the footage of doing that, but it was only soldering, so you've not missed out on much. So the orange and grey wires are soldered onto the terminals, the springs have been removed, and that is completely insulated. Some Labelle 106 grease is put on the worm gear and the spigot there. And then I'm just going to add a small amount of Fleischmann oil because this will thin that grease down a bit and help it travel through the drivetrain a lot better. The plastic insulators are all back in place. Well, they will be when I put this one on. And then the motor halves are rejoined, having been thoroughly cleaned, as you've just seen. So making sure that plastic insulator is where it should be, I refit the two halves of the chassis eventually. It's a bit of a job to try and line that up. I was trying to line it up with that plastic because I didn't want the plastic sheath to be bent, so it was a bit of a job. And then the bottom plastic insulators decided to fall out of position, so I have to put those back in place as well. You need three hands really to sort these split chassis models out sometimes. But when the plastic insulators were back in place and I was sure that everything was insulated correctly, I refit the screws to secure both halves of the chassis. And now for electrical pickup, what I'm going to do is the black and red wire off the DCC decoder harness, I'm going to wrap around the body securing screw that goes underneath the cab there to make a hoop, and then I'm going to solder that hoop so it's strong. Put some solder on it. There's a little bit of flux on there as well to help the solder flow, and that creates a soldered wired ring that will sit around the screw and provide pickup from each side of the chassis without having to mill out or drill any of the die-cast chassis at all. So the screw goes through the hoop there, as you can see, and then when I get it lined up, I just tighten the screw up gently, not to break the wire. And that is one of the pickups done on one side of the model, and the same, exactly the same was done for the red wire on the opposite side. And you can see there that that wire now is all nice and secure. It will fit in the body shell. And DCC fitting these, even though they are split chassis, is a relatively simple affair. So now the chassis is DCC fitted, the decoder has been put onto the harness, and I'm going to use a multimeter to make sure there's no short circuits on the sound settings, so there's no short circuits across the chassis. And next I'm going to give these wheel openings another thorough clean, because like I said, these are imperative to this model. This is where the model gets its electrical current pickup through. And then the wheels are given a thorough clean, including the axle stubs and the wheel treads, so that everything is absolutely as clean as it can be for when we go and test this model on the layout. As for servicing these models, this one is easier than the mainline one that we did in the last episode, because you don't actually have to strip the motor down and clean out the brushes and the commutator, etc. It's a self-contained motor. It is just a case of cleaning all the old lubrication off, insulating the motor terminals by removing the springs, and then adding some heat shrink over the motor terminals when you solder the wires on, and then using that hoop technique to provide pickups. Now the wheels will only go in one way. One side of the side rods is shorter than the other. So the longer side, I think, if I remember rightly, goes towards the cab, and make sure the oil box representations are facing upwards. A small amount of grease on the gear, and then I'm going to use some Pico Electrolube on the wheel stubs. This is conductive lubricant, so that will also aid in electrical pickup. I'll just add a tiny drop on each one there, and then the cover plate is refitted. Now that Pico Electrolube, that is quite an expensive bottle, for something that's such a little bottle, but it does last a very, very long time. So once the keeper plate is on, the screws are replaced, and then I'll be in a position to test the model. Now, what I'm going to do, because it's a split chassis one, I am going to now try and test it with the multimeter, as I said, so there's no short circuits there. If I put them on the same rail, you can hear it bleeping, so I know that it's working. And then a battery test proves that the model is running now, and it is DCC fitted, and it's running a lot freer now that old grease and lubrication has been removed. I'll just give it a nudge. That's the test track. It's very dirty. I'm just touching the decoder there to make sure it's not warm, which it isn't. So I'm satisfied that we've successfully chipped this model, and it's almost back to running order. When chipping these models, I find it easier to remove that cab section so that the body shell can go on, and then the decoder can be manipulated in the cab space easily. It's better to try and do that than it is to try and fit it on with that cab detail on. So pulling the decoder through the model, the rear clips are re-engaged, and then with some black tack I'm going to tack that decoder, which is factory insulated. That insulation is on from the factory. Tag that in on top of the motor block, and then, as I did with the mainline one last week, I'm going to cover that with a bit of black insulation tape so that you can't see it. I know that's a cab full of wires, but it's better to have it running than not. And then the top of the cab detail is then refitted, and then that steam pipe and handrail detail are threaded back through the holes which are in the spectacle plate of the cab there. So you might be thinking, well, this is that rebuild almost done, but unfortunately you would be wrong. Now, although it ran okay with the battery, when it was tested with the battery, the model runs absolutely fine because it's at relatively low speed. As you'll see, it's just meandering up and down this 6-inch length of test track. When it was put on the layout, the model had a very nasty kick, and it would not run very well at all under DCC power. So I was beginning to think it was the axles, because on this model I hadn't changed the axles because they didn't appear to be split. But as you can see, before we get onto that, it is a nice looking model, and the paint finish on this is slightly better than that mainline one, although I did repaint that. But I do like these J72 tanks. They do look really, really nice. And it just proves that you can DCC fit these older ones and don't have to fork out for the new ones. But as I was saying, the model had a really bad kick. So it was upended in the loco cradle, and honestly I spent ages on this model trying to get this to run. And by ages I meant 2 or 3 weeks on and off. I got some new axles from Peter Spares. These axles on this model are the ones with the square pegs in so that you can quarter them correctly. And I knew that they were quartered, so I replaced the axles. These were all done. You can see I've took them apart here. Refitted all the axles, made sure they were quartered correctly. Put them back in the model, and the kick was still there. Now you'll see I've cleaned all the wheels again, so I'm just re-lubricating them. But on DCC, the kick was still there, and although it ran very well on the battery, as you can see here, on DCC it just would not run properly. And put it on the layout was an absolute disaster. And what I ended up doing in the end was, you can see the green J72 in the background. I actually borrowed this from Trains for You, and this is a perfect runner, to see where I was going wrong with the black one, because no matter what I did, I couldn't get it to stop kicking, and it was the front axle that was the problem. So I borrowed this green one and did a bit of an autopsy and changed the wheels over and found it ran fine. So it was definitely a wheelset problem. So I decided to have a look into this, and the wheel set on the front, the original wheel set on my black J72, the wheel stub diameter was 5.96. But then on the middle wheel, on the rear wheel, it was 5.68. Now the the wheel stub on the wheel had actually expanded. This is the result. This is what resulted in the axles cracking. So I can't help but wonder if there's a tiny bit of Mazak rot or something in these wheels. And you see here, look, it is so tight, I can't actually pull that off that axle. It is enlarged so much. And I can't help but think that if this metal is expanding on these models, that is the cause of all the cracked axles you get and poor running on a lot of these J72s. So when I sourced a spare axle off another damaged J72 that the model shop had in, it ran absolutely fine and perfect, and it was in fact, after 2 weeks of investigation on and off, an oversized front axle that was causing the problems. So it's something to watch out for if you have one of these models. But as you can see now, this second J72 is now trundling around the garden, happy as Larry, DCC fitted and running absolutely lovely. If you've got anything you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Trap, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. If you've got anything to repair or donate, please contact me and I'll tell you how to get in touch and send it over. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I will leave you now with some shots of the J72 running around the garden. This was filmed several weeks ago before the weather changed, and I've also got the main line one out running with it as well, so there's a pair now of operational J72s on my layout. One that was given to me by my great aunt, which is this one here, and the other one, 69022, which I bought as a non-runner and is now happily running DCC fitted on the garden. Bye for now. What is wrong with that coach?